All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to the Wednesday afternoon of SharePoint Conference 2014. Thought we'd start something kind of fun. This is a session around apps, and actually one of the things that we're going to do during this session is talk about how the app model really extends across our entire productivity platform. It's not just a SharePoint thing. If you've seen things around our common consent framework, we have some cool things that extend all the way through Exchange and some of the Office apps as well. This is actually a PowerPoint content app that just connects to a Yammer feed, and we thought it'd be a fun way just to start off the session. So I did a session this morning on social mining that we use this, and we thought we'd use it here as well. So what we're going to do is talk about some advanced patterns in cloud-hosted apps. And apparently Nathan animates in, but I don't. My name is Richard DeZerga. I'm a productivity architect out of the MTC in Dallas, and I'm here with...
And I'm Nathan Miller. I'm a solution specialist with Microsoft, with our Microsoft Services group.
So Nathan and I have done a lot of work in the app model over the past 2.5 years, and got the opportunity to talk to a lot of ISVs around how to build apps, and spent a lot of time actually building an app that we're going to walk through today. So you guys have probably seen this slide talking about the Office 365 platform and how we're continuing to double down on this app model. So we're continuing to add new APIs, new SDKs, like things that allow us to build apps for even things like Android, and that's going to be a continued investment moving forward. In terms of what we're going to do today, we want to talk about some really advanced patterns in provider-hosted apps. So this isn't a SharePoint-hosted app session. It's not auto-hosted. This is provider-hosted apps. And that's really where we see, I would say, the more advanced type of applications that you might build that leverage the productivity suite. Some of the things we're going to go through are talk about some of the tenancy considerations. I don't want to scare you. I had a few people come up beforehand and say, is this something that's really just for cloud, for Office 365, or are we going to talk about things that are relevant on premise? Everything that we're talking about is relevant to either place. Tenancy is just as important for one organization as it is in Office 365. We could build applications that might need to take tenancy into consideration just for one application. So maybe by department or division, it's important to separate different data. And so we're going to talk about how you might go about doing something like that. We're going to talk about some of the interesting things around dealing with security and identity across both SharePoint apps and even some of the Office apps. So the solution we're going to walk through is relatively complete in terms of its use of the stack. We're going to also look at some patterns and approaches for delivering a complete solution. Again, if you're going to leverage the app model, don't limit yourself just to what maybe you've seen on a few slides of I can create an app part. There's some really great things you can do when you incorporate the full stack. We're going to do this by covering an application that me and Nathan developed called Help Desk. So Help Desk happens to be, just out of quick curiosity, show of hands, anyone use the Fab 40 templates in the past? And I hear laughter.
Wow.
Yeah. The most popular of all the Fab 40 was the Help Desk template. And so when we worked with product marketing about a year ago and talking about what would be a good scenario to build out as an app, this is kind of where we fell. And so we decided to take on Help Desk as a cloud-hosted app. And when we say cloud-hosted, again, I think there's some misconceptions over that term. Cloud just means it's not running in SharePoint. It's not on the same box as SharePoint. We're going to run it somewhere else. That could be on another IIS server. Heck, it could be on an Apache server. We don't care. In this case, we're going to run it from Azure, but you could really run it from anywhere you want. So we're going to walk through this application and go through some of the aspects and things, the challenges that me and Nathan ran into along the way. I will also say that this is primarily, the Help Desk application has been primarily something used internally at Microsoft to evangelize the app model. But Nathan will talk to us a little bit at the end. We are doing some things to make actually the entire solution available. We're not going to put it in the store. We talked about maybe putting it in the store, but primarily we want to get the patterns and the code out to the field. And so we're going to eventually have this out on GitHub. We have a link to where we have that stubbed out today, and I would think probably within a month we'll have the solution out on GitHub. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan, and Nathan is going to give us the introduction into the concept of tenancy in apps.
All right, so the first thing we really needed to decide when we were looking at this application and how to build this was how are we going to manage the data in this application? And so in this case, we were looking at, we wanted to have this hosted out there, and we needed to decide on how would we segment data. Would it be that we would segment the data based on, we actually started with, every time the app gets installed in a new site, we'll go ahead and provision a database for that. But if you kind of think about the scale of that, it just really doesn't scale well, and it ends up being fairly costly if you kind of look at that type of model. So what we finally decided to do was let's just segment the data in our database, or actually have kind of data all combined in our database, but have it segmented in the views and in the data tiers of our application. So the other thing that we wanted to decide on was we knew right up front that we wanted to really have everything hit centralized kind of web services and centralized application, and then basically have those application tiers just segment that data for us. So it really came down to probably the way you look at most data and kind of segmentation is it's kind of an argument of cost versus security. So in this case, we decided that the applications and the data that we've got for this application isn't really that sensitive of information, but also we've got it separated out in such a way that we felt comfortable with the decision that we ended up doing. Hosting criteria.
Yeah, so from a hosting criteria standpoint, one of the things we also wanted to think about is this is a 300 level app session. We're not going to go deep into code, but we are going to talk about some deep concepts. One of those is when we talk about a provider hosted app, you're going to have at the very least what we call a remote web. You also have the potential of leveraging what we call an app web. An app web hosts SharePoint things, right? And so when we were looking at this application and said, if I want to store things like attachments, I'm going to open up a new ticket and I want to maybe provide a screenshot of the error that I'm getting in some application, where are we going to store that? We made the decision we did not want to use the app web for two reasons. We didn't want to use the app web primarily because when I go and upload a bunch of images or a bunch of things, I have no clue what someone might actually want to upload as part of a ticket. It may even be a video. I don't want to bloat someone's site collection or content database because ultimately an app web is a subsite underneath wherever that application is installed. That's reason number one. Reason number two, and Nathan is, I think, going to give us a demonstration of this, is when we were to maybe uninstall the application, when you uninstall an app, the reason there's an app web is so it cleans up nicely. We delete the entire site. And therefore, we didn't want someone to accidentally go off and delete the application and lose all of those attachments. And therefore, the choice we made was we'd actually store any sort of attachments in a blob storage that was external to SharePoint, the SharePoint App Web.
All right, so the first thing that we wanted to do was when the application gets installed, whether we put this application in the store or whether we just have people install it into an environment, we wanted to seed the application with portions of information. So essentially, when we look at kind of the tenancy, we needed to load up some tables. So whenever you have to do any kind of pre-work or provisioning of an application, you're really going to want to look at some of the app install events or the app events. So in this case, what we had to do was actually use the app install event on the SharePoint app. So when it actually gets added to a site, it executes that app install event. It goes out there and checks to see, do I have a registered tenant for this, or is this the first time I'm installing for this given company or this given user? So same thing with your applications. If you're looking at segmenting your data by department or segmenting your data by sub-company, you'll have to do similar checks if you're doing that in the data. So in this case, I've got my app event receiver pulled up here. And you'll see that I've got it. So app event receivers do a process event. So when the app actually gets installed, in my case, I'm actually using Office 365 for a developer tenant. And I'm connecting to that developer tenant and stepping through this debugger. So I'll go ahead and run this and kind of walk through what that looks like. So it's installing, it's deploying the app. It's, like I said, I'm using a developer tenant. And I will say that even if you're doing on-premise development, it's actually pretty nice to have one of these developer tenants that you can quickly kind of dev and test scenarios on. So in this case, I'll go ahead and trust the application. And so if you're doing app install events, I highly recommend hooking up the debugger to it, because there's a lot of logic that might be in this event. And if it fails during the process, you want to be able to figure out what's going on with that. So it's kind of this app event trigger.
And maybe to clarify, for those that are new to this, ultimately these remote events, what happens when I say I want my application to have a remote event, it's going to create a web service endpoint inside of your web application that SharePoint can actually call into. So Nathan, how are you going to call into localhost here if you're using a local machine? How is SharePoint able to hit that breakpoint?
Yeah, so the way it works is, in this case, we're using Service Bus to do debugging. So what ends up happening is when I install that application onto SharePoint Online or my developer tenant, it's listening to a Service Bus message that Visual Studio uses to pass basically a debug message to attach the debugger to it. So this got installed in Office 365. I'm using a Service Bus connection through Visual Studio, and I'll show you where that is in here. And then it actually connects to that breakpoint when that event happens in Office 365, so I can actually step through my local host debugging. So anyway, I'm not going to go through all this, but I'll kind of show you what we're doing in here. So we go through the client context, and one of the things that we'll talk about later is we need to establish what the client context is. So in this case, we go in, we make a call to the local web, say, okay, what's the tenant that I'm going to? And then what we do is look to see if we've got that registered in our app model. And if we do, if we don't have it registered, then we'll go ahead and load up our tenant information. So let me go ahead and stop this, and let me show you one more thing in here. So I'll go into, so one of the things that we did in here, let me show you this data, is when we run the load event, when we want to provision and seed our information for our application, we go ahead and actually, we put a lot of, any of the data that we're loading for provisioning that tenant, we actually put into basically a data table. So what happens is that app event looks to see if the tenant's been loaded, and if it hasn't, we go ahead and execute all these SQL commands for that given tenant so that we load up enough of the lookup tables and whatnot in our application model. Okay.
Switch back to the slides. So again, the key there is that we want to capture the tenant when they go to install the application. We want to see who they are, and we want to seed a table with them, because ultimately, as we go deeper into like our data model, every single table has a tenant ID on it. That was very, very important so that we can really try to isolate one user's data versus another. And again, tenant could be different departments within your company. I want to talk a little bit about trials. When you think trial, you might think this is something more for like the office store. However, one of the approaches we took to this is actually a really complex application. When you think about configuring the engineers that work tickets, what geography they relate to, what sort of I would say ticket sensitivity levels or priority levels, all of that's very configurable within this application. And we wanted it to be a very slow ramp-up time for someone to be able to actually start using the application. So one of the things we did is we implemented what we call a getting started wizard within this. And it was, in a way, it was kind of inspired by the getting started wizard that's in Team Sites inside of SharePoint 2013. Is we really wanted to walk a user through a way of getting things set up. And then two is if we wanted to set this up to do maybe some sort of trial or maybe a test for within an organization to see if it's something that would work, is that it would be really easy to do that. And so we have the ability of actually loading some demo data. This was really important because this application started as something inside Microsoft, and we might have 100 different employees in Microsoft wanting to provision this and be able to demo it to customers. And so that was a big part of what we wanted to achieve. So what I'm going to show you is I'm going to go ahead and launch into the help desk application on my end. I'm going to show you what it looks like the first time we go into it as a brand new tenant. So what you're going to see is it's actually going to say, we noticed that you're new, we haven't set up any data for you. Can we help you get started? I can actually say no to this if I wanted to, but I want to walk you guys through the wizard and what happens in this. So one of the things we thought is that, generally, even if I'm a help desk manager that's kind of setting this up for the first time, I'm probably pretty closely connected with the help desk engineers. So one of the quick ways of setting up this application, I can go do like people picking, but I can much more easily just go and say, let me look at the people that I follow. And so you're starting to see already some places where even though I'm outside of SharePoint now in a provider-hosted app, we're definitely doing a lot of calls back into SharePoint to be able to use the type of information that's exposed to me through the SharePoint APIs. So you can see things like the concept of following, that social data that we're looking at. I'm looking at profile information like people's names and pictures that I can actually use in this case. So what I'll do is maybe just pick 4 or 5 people to be engineers. We'll do these 4, and I'll go ahead and say go. And now at this point in time, this might take about anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds because it's actually loading a lot of data into this tenant because we chose to load demo data. This is going to go load I think 20 tickets, a bunch of alerts, and things within the system for us to start using. So this will take just a moment to complete. And once it completes, you'll see that basically I'm off to the races. I'm ready to go. I can tweak around a few things, but this will be pretty much loaded and ready to go. So looks like it's loaded. So now you can see I already have a set of alerts. I have a bunch of tickets that are already pre-created here. I even have, you can see some help desk ticket notifications coming in via email. I even have some things like, some of my settings that are preset here. So I could add new engineers. We're leveraging some very rich controls that you might expect in SharePoint, like people pickers. So if I wanted to add Alex as an engineer to the site, I can certainly do new engineers. I can change, the coloring of our categories of tickets. I can even monitor certain hashtags. So it's another case of where we're going and connecting into SharePoint and leveraging some of the value of SharePoint. So things like maybe some of the folksonomies and taxonomies that are out here. So I could do things like maybe I want to monitor Wi-Fi or network. And as an engineer, what we'll see is I'll be able to actually listen to that and see if there are issues. And I also have things like priority levels. So we have 4 priority levels, and I can set the SLAs on those as well. So again, the idea is that you could see within a few seconds I was able to get a user completely up and going by providing some quick ways via a wizard to get rolling within the application.
Yeah, so one of the things when we decided to kind of go through the framework, we really, both of us are big fans of the Entity Framework. So we decided that, we're definitely going with Entity Framework to make our coding experience a little easier. And as our scope creep ended up happening as our model got more complex, it really kind of kept us in a fairly easy model to kind of manage our environment. The other thing that we ended up doing, in this case, we were deploying to SQL Azure. We started out with SQL on-premise. You saw Richard still running localhost and local DB for a lot of the stuff. But the one thing to be aware of is if you are targeting SQL Azure, I would say it's really 99.5% same as on-prem SQL. There are a couple minor differences. So be aware when you're going through kind of testing, before you go to kind of some of the deployment, do some test cycles of your application, of your deployment in your application in SQL Azure as well to make sure that it's functioning the exact same way that you plan on it being on-premise. The other thing that we decided to do in this go-around, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be releasing, but we also decided that, we're going to actually expose all of our services via REST services. So we're using WCF in this version, and we decided to actually do REST-enabled services. But it actually caused a little bit of problems with some of the framework components. For example, the thing that we showed you in the beginning as far as the app event receivers, SharePoint actually will do, or Visual Studio will do some help for you as far as kind of setting up the bindings for your services, which is great. But if you've got different bindings leveraging WCF and some of the different kind of custom bindings, you don't necessarily want to have someone injecting bindings into your WCF bindings. So it causes some pain points as far as doing protocol bindings versus doing kind of named services bindings. So just be aware of that if you're going kind of the WCF route, and maybe start with named bindings if you're using different types of data services stuff. Go ahead and switch over. Oh.
So that's data and services. If we kind of take a look at the UI and branding side of this, one of the first things when I showed this to the product marketing managers at Microsoft, they're like, well, why not the Chrome control? The Chrome control is fantastic. If you really want to keep a consistent look and feel as you leave SharePoint into another site, I think it's a great way to kind of give it that feel of still being SharePoint. You know, when we went through this, we actually rebranded this like 6 or 7 times, I felt like, and we went back and forth. Should we use the Chrome control? Should we not? And I think where we kind of landed is if we're going to have some sort of brand, like help desk being like a product possibly that we would put in the store, I think it's absolutely something that is okay to not use the Chrome control and use your full brand. So, you know, we are following the guidelines of an app where I have a link back to the landing page of where I came from, but I think it's totally feasible that you don't have to use the Chrome control. One of the reasons we wanted to do that specifically was to provide a responsive experience. I'll demonstrate here in a moment is the help desk application versus me going out and creating a bunch of native applications for like iOS or Android or who knows what. We really decided instead is let's just deliver this to where it is browser friendly in terms of, you know, a mobile browser that everything adjusts nicely and works in that type of form factor. So, you know, we did a lot of work around optimizing that. The first time around, we did most of that, I would say, without using external libraries. We're in the process now of implementing more of a standard with like the Twitter Bootstrap in order to achieve that. The other thing is that, you know, we felt like using some of the other things, even though it's a full page app, there's certainly a lot of other things that are available in the app model that we could incorporate. So things like app parts. So one of the things that we do have is, let's say that I want to put alerts on maybe just the general IT site within SharePoint. We can go and grab that app part and put it anywhere. And so we make big use of app parts throughout the application as well to bring the right information forward to the user where it makes sense. A little bit more on securities and roles. Nathan's going to look a little bit into this. We're going to show you a little bit about this, but the concept of a tenant is completely transparent to an end user. They never see a tenant ID. They don't know that they're just an ID to us back in the back end of this application. However, all of the services, every single one of the services does a get tenant. And so we did a lot of work to make sure that we couldn't do some sort of cross-tenant hacks where if I'm one company or one division within our company that we couldn't go and see other types of information. It's completely transparent to the end user, so it's very well hardened from that standpoint. The other thing is we did security trimming at the UI as well. So the concept of a normal user going to open a help desk ticket versus an engineer. So we do a lot of security trimming. And again, some of that's done client side, but a lot of that's done in the back end as well so that, again, I can't have a user just go and hack and become an engineer on certain things. And again, you see things like you know, people pickers and taxonomy pickers throughout to provide a good experience. And I think one of the key things we'll take a look at here is we don't do much with post-back operations. A lot of what we do is all client-side. However, for things that are really, really secure, like resetting your entire tenant, so imagine I go and I download a trial, I load it with demo data, and then there's a button that says clear out all my data. That's probably not something that we want to make so easily accessible via a REST service. And so for some of those more critical operations like loading demo data, resetting the tenant, we do post-backs in that case, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. So we want to go into a demo now where we show you more of the back-end architecture, and then we'll go into the UI components around responsive UI and some of the security.
So just real quick, as far as kind of how some of this looks, if you look at kind of our tenant table, that everything's kind of forked off of, and basically this is where we kind of filter off of all of the different calls that we've got. And I'll kind of show you the security calls that we make on our services front end. The other thing that we decided on as well is, when we're looking at this application, we ended up having kind of a sub-application in here that we'll show you. Is we basically, later on we'll show you kind of a mail app that we ended up doing was with kind of a survey engine in there as well. So one of the decisions we had to make as well is, does it make sense to kind of split out the models, or does it make sense to kind of have that combined framework of both things? And it really came down to, we had so much reuse in the services that we actually ended up combining a lot of the projects and just having kind of a centralized services as well as the data models in there. So in the services themselves, what Richard was talking about on the tenant, and the same rule kind of applies if we're, say, for example, we've got employee IDs at Microsoft, and if I had expense report services, is basically what I don't want to do is have that user, I know who the user is. I've got the operational contract, or I've got the Windows integrated security. So don't ever ask, for an identity for that. We had the same concept, is our services, if you look at, for example, get alerts, it takes no parameters. But we use the operational contract to actually get the current context of what that tenant is, and then we go look them up in the database to see what identities that we need to populate and do the checks. So you see on here, we've got tenant, get tenant, and if that fails, we'll actually kick them out of any of the service calls. So all of our service calls basically go through this get tenant check, regardless of whether they're coming through a mail app, whether they're coming through the services, or whether they're coming through postbacks as well. Okay.
So moving back to the front end of things, I'm here just on what I would consider an IT site, and you can see that I have an app part of our alerts. So one of the great things about an app part is a few things. One is it can incorporate the styles of where it's being displayed. So it may not show up too great on there, but it's taking on the same branding or theme that we have within the host site itself. The other thing that's very strategic about these is they can resize themselves, or they can at least ask to be resized. So as someone adds a new alert, I'm going to need more real estate for that alert, and I can simply post a message out to what we call the host web, and I can say I need another 50 pixels of height in order to display that new alert. And so, again, you would never know, or at least an end user would never know by looking at this, that I'm looking at an iframe, but that's exactly what this is. It's an iframe out to our app, and the host page is posting some information to make that viewable. As I go into this application, I'm an engineer in this case. So you can see I have a lot of different options available to me, from going and viewing statistics about the application. I can go look at, this is actually some social activity where I can go monitor, very similar to what we did when we walked in here. I can go monitor, someone's complaining about Wi-Fi. Do we need to go look into Wi-Fi? If I were to go in as a different user here, this is Garth Fort, and Garth is just a normal user. So you can see his user interface is significantly different from what an engineer sees. So we do all that security trimming, where ultimately the only thing Garth can do is view alerts, and he could go out and he could certainly create a new ticket. In this case, he has no tickets, but he could create one. Wi-Fi sucks. We'll make that network. Conference. Wi-Fi is never good. And I'll go ahead and say, okay. One of the interesting things we're doing is we actually geocode everything. So we're using the browser-aware location. So check that out. It automatically knows that I'm in the Palazzo. So, and what's great is that also works on the mobile device. So speaking of that, I mentioned that this is responsive. So I thought I'd show you an example of that. Is here's the application once I shrink it down. You notice that it changes its form factor. I no longer see the user's picture. But everything is really optimized to be responsive. So, what we chose was we wanted to make things responsive down to about 320 pixels wide. So we're very strategic about the types of UIs, things that we do. All of our dialogues, for instance, are optimized for that 320 pixels. So it works really nicely within most phones. So I can come in here and, again, if I want to create an alert based upon something, I can do that, and it works perfectly in that smaller form factor. The last thing I was going to talk about here is the concept of resetting. And so if you look here, we're doing a few things on the UI. Even things like saves, we're not saving things one at a time. If I were to add a bunch of things here, like another engineer, like let's go ahead and add Garth as an engineer. And let's maybe add another ticket category. I'll call this SPC. And I'll change a priority level to 100. None of this has actually been saved. In fact, if I click away, what it's going to say is, do you want to discard these changes? We're really trying to be cognizant and not try to make a whole bunch of round trips to really provide a better user experience. So we're not saving until the user actually clicks a save here. But the one place where we are doing a post back, like I mentioned, is down here at the bottom. You can see that it says, do you want to reset the help desk? And if I were to click reset the help desk, I'm not sure I'm ready to reset the help desk. Let's do this one instead. So I'll go ahead and do it from the local host version instead of my real one in Azure. And what that's basically going to do, it's going to set it back from square one. It's going to go clear out all that tenant data. We'll make, again, we're going to make a second, hey, are you positive you want to do this? But we felt like that was an important thing if we were going to incorporate the concept of a trial, or if you want to set up like a QA, a test environment or something like that. So I'll go ahead and click reset the help desk. It says, are you sure you really want to do this? I'll go ahead and say OK. And what you'll see is here in a second, it starts back from the very beginning. So now it's back to the getting started wizard. Cool? Yep.
All right, so next what we're going to talk about is the mail apps. So one of the things that, and I think mail apps are one of the types of applications that both Richard and I really tend to like. It kind of changes, you know, if you think about how email-centric we tend to be. I know that there's a lot of social sessions, but you think about, you've got your email up, you know, most of the time, and you're constantly kind of searching for latest updates of what was the last status of that, or what was that ticket number and whatnot. So mail apps really kind of help with getting kind of current status, or in our case, we're doing current status. We're also doing kind of a survey app as well for closed tickets. So one of the challenges that we had, and actually just recently got resolved in the framework that they've updated in this last week or two, is the idea that when I actually have a current user that's logged in, how do you identify what user is coming into the system? So you've got their email address, but you don't necessarily know where they came from. So if you're doing multiple companies, it was kind of a challenge to actually do a registration process to get what ID and what company that ID maps to. It's actually a little harder than you think, because if it's a cloud ID, it might be different than an on-premise kind of park domain. Or if there's multiple companies, you got to try to map it back to a valid scenario, a valid set of data. The other thing that we needed too was, because we were making calls from the mail app into SharePoint, we needed to have an app-only call. So when we registered the tenant, we actually saved off an identity so that we could actually make app-only calls straight from the Outlook into the SharePoint data as well. Yeah, and then so I guess one tip that I'd give you too is, when you're building mail apps, design the UI first before you actually start testing it in the mail app. Because when you do the development and testing, it actually goes through the whole kind of deployment process, and it really kind of is time-consuming when you're really just trying to do basic design and development of it. And then once you kind of get the development down, or the design down that you want, then do the final kind of testing in the mail environment.
So one thing, Nathan's going to show the mail apps. I know we're I would say a heavy SharePoint-focused crowd. So I do want to point out one thing, is that the mail apps, just to answer some question you might have, they do require Exchange 2013. If you happen to be an Office 365 customer, then you are probably in good shape. Otherwise, if you're on-premise, you do need Exchange 2013. However, because they are so contextual, I don't know an organization that couldn't get value out of some sort of mail app. So take it away, Nathan, with the mail apps here.
Yeah, so a couple things in here. We actually did some integration into social, so I'm going to show you kind of an update that happens here. But I'm going to go ahead and close this app, and we actually send out a couple of emails which launch some mail apps for us on our Outlook. So I went ahead and go ahead and save this, and then I'll go ahead and close this as well. And so I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to head over to my Outlook and actually show you what some of these mail apps do that function. And mail apps are a great way to kind of really extend, like I said, line of business applications and whatnot. So I'm logged in as Garth. You're going to see 2 mail apps that are coming up here. So first off, you'll see that we are integrated into social. So automatically, we're going to get the social feed information into our apps as well. So kind of another scenario where we've got some SharePoint information where we can actually post ticket updates, and it'll actually show up in their news feed or wall feed. So it's kind of nice to have. Plus, obviously, with our social connections, it actually sends an email out in that as well. But now I'll see that I've got some emails from the help desk. And so first off, I've got a ticket status. So I can actually click on a ticket status app. We basically do rules activation based on help desk and ticket status. And then we actually launch our application. So here, I actually make a call back into our REST services with the ID that's coming off of it. And then we actually can pull current status of it. So I don't have to run around and look for the latest message that I've got. I can always get the latest status based on any of these through this mail app. But the other thing we decided to do was, it's actually pretty common that our help desk at Microsoft asks us to fill out surveys. And so they send us an email, and we click the link and kind of go through a survey for this. So one of the things that we can do is we can also do a take survey. And like I said, we built a whole survey engine in there. So we're just using a help desk survey engine, but we can actually pull any kind of survey and have them take it in their mail, just queued off of the identity here. And in this case, we're actually queuing off of survey : and then basically tag words in the keywords in here. But I can actually take the full survey in here. So yeah, I was happy with the experience. I called the help desk. Actually, I used the ticket open, and it was under a day. So one thing to note is when you're in a mail app, you've got to do basically get in here. So I'm actually making a get call back to my REST service to actually save off that data. So we can't do posts within the mail apps. Hit next. This was great. Thanks. Go ahead and complete it. And then I can go ahead and close it. So it's just another way that we can actually have mail apps interact with us and extend our application as opposed to them coming back to the application. Ready?
I want to talk a little bit about how you're getting identity.
I did a little bit. Okay. We're switching it, though, so yeah.
OK. Actually. So the next thing we want to talk about is a little bit about reporting. We spent a lot of time looking at a few different help desk applications in terms of what it provided for reporting. And we were going through a list of like, well, we need to create this report and this report. And ultimately, we came down to the fact that it's too hard for us to guess. This was more of a making a demonstration type of application, and we don't know that world all that well. And so what we decided to do is maybe let's leverage, again, we want to leverage the breadth of this app platform and be able to maybe take advantage of some of the other types of apps. So one of the great apps that there is an app for Excel. It's a task pane app. Excel has a few different types of apps, but what we decided is let's use an Excel app. That's where people are going to want to take their data anyway and try to report against it. So let's maybe use an application like that to be able to go and pull down just raw data. We'll give them raw data. It'll be kind of their way of doing a connection and getting through to pull that in. And then they can use any type of reporting they want within Excel. They could pull it into Power View. They could do pivot charts, tables, whatever you want within that. One of I would say the key challenges of doing this is that when we thought about just making a normal Excel app, if I never go to SharePoint and I pull up Excel and I launch my task pane app, how am I going to know who the user is? That was a big thing, is that really we call it the JSON model, the JavaScript object model for Office apps didn't really have the concept of an identity. And so identity was something that we needed to try to address. And what we came up with was, let's maybe just host the application out of SharePoint. So we're actually using the app web, even though this is a provider-hosted app, we're actually using the app web of SharePoint to host our Office application. And so I might need you to pull yours up here. We'll see. I'll try it here first. So here's our base reporting. We provide a couple of just high-level views. What is the tickets for the past 7 days? So you can see I don't have that many tickets over the past 7 days. But you can see my trends over lifetime, and obviously mine's not a real scenario here, so it kind of has weird spikes, but you would kind of expect things to be a little bit more stagnant on the two ends of the spectrum here. But if you notice at the top, we have a button that says Analyze in Excel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just really quickly do a zoom it. Oh, that's not zoom it. If you look at the bottom, it's basically pointing to an Excel report that we have sitting out on our app web. So that's a typical URL that you would see for an app web, which is your tenant and then dash. It has some sort of unique identifier, and then that points actually to the Excel document. So we preloaded, you could think of it as an Excel template that we have out there with our application preloaded inside of it. And so when I click on this, what it does is it loads the template within our app. And I'm having a little bit of connectivity issues with mine here. So we're going to hopefully see if Nathan's will work, and if it doesn't, we'll move on. But ultimately, I can speak to this, is what we're doing is we're basically calling into the same REST services that our application calls into. But because I know where the tenant came from, we can provide that information on the back end. The back end will know that this is, tenant 123, and we should only pull tenant 123's data. And then what we do is we just send pure OData back, inject OData in as a table inside of Excel, and then, again, I can use any of the Excel reporting capabilities within it.
Nope.
But we'll move on then. Cool?
Yep.
Okay. Go here.
Yeah, very good time to go back then.
Yep.
Yep.
So we wanted to maybe talk about a few additional tips and tricks that we couldn't really think of the right way to fit things in here. So one of those is consider the scenario where a user navigates directly to your application. This is something that in the first version of the tooling, no one really handled well because Token Helper didn't take it into consideration. So for on-premise, this isn't quite as important, but if you're building something for Office 365, Office 365, if an app needs context. And so what happens when you open an app, it actually posts some information to the application that the app can use to go and get an access token. In an on-prem world, the app actually just creates its own access tokens using a certificate. So what we found is as we let a few people use this, they were bookmarking our app pages. And what would happen is they'd try to open the app and they couldn't get context. And so what you can do is now with the SharePoint utilities that are part of the tooling, it handles this for you. So make sure that as you're building applications, if you haven't updated your tooling, that's really important to use that new utility. It makes it very easy. It basically in pre-init is going to go and do a check, and if it's not available, the contextual information it needs, it will go to the app redirect page in SharePoint to get context. The other thing is to think about authentication to other areas you're going to leverage. So the app web versus the My Site host, different places that you might need to connect to. My one vent I will say is that IE security zones in the app model can be a big pain. What happens is if you have a SharePoint site that you consider a trusted site or an intranet site, and your app is not, you can get into a lot of issues making calls where it'll actually try to go and do the login redirect when you see things. So make sure that you keep that in mind. If you're going to deploy a really important application that's provider hosted, it might be something that you want to make sure that you go and put a group policy to have it be something that's trusted. I want to cover this.
Yeah, so the other thing to kind of keep in mind is when you look at exposing your services or having connection to the different services, really think about hardening those services kind of up front. Make sure that you're not passing in any kind of keys or any kind of information that you can kind of track back to kind of useful information or be able to segment that data. The other thing that, if you're publishing applications, publish early. So the one thing that you don't want to do is get kind of behind the loop and not be able to kind of quickly publish or quickly update things. So one thing that I really got used to in kind of the pattern was when I started publishing it, I get a lot more comfortable with republishing them. And one of the things that I found, and I'll actually show this, is especially when you're looking at kind of client ID, client secrets. So I kind of keep a list of the different environments that I'm publishing to and the proper keys. But what else I do is if you look at the transformation keys in your web configs, set those up so that when you're publishing a build to a release, publishing a build to UAT, that it actually switches that client ID, client secret for you so that you don't have to kind of keep track of that in there. Also, the one thing that's kind of silly, but test with multiple tenants, multiple seeds of information. So if you're segmenting any of your data, I would say that probably 80–90% of our bugs were due to it working with, works great with one tenant, but when someone else registered their tenant, their information, we actually found a bug where we weren't filtering things properly, or we weren't expecting kind of multiple data sets. So kind of keep that in mind as well. So one of the things that we're doing is we're making some changes into the environment, and when we kind of showed this last time, we got a lot of requests to actually get this as kind of a working example, and we thought about hosting it and kind of figuring out how that would look like. But ultimately, what we decided was, it's really kind of important to give you guys kind of this code base as just a good sample set of how to do kind of complex applications, whether it be in the cloud or whether it be on premise. And some of the different kind of utilities that we do, and hopefully we can get the Excel app up, but for example, like the Excel app, we actually have a generic method in the Excel app that can connect to any REST service, and it actually generates a table object for you. So some things like that, I think there's some very good patterns in here that you guys can leverage in your existing code base. So here's where we've got it. It's just a placeholder right now. There's no content out there, but like Richard said, in about a month, we'll actually have we'll publish it out there. We're switching a lot of it to be kind of pure MVC. So one of the things that we found was, because we had a solid data model and we had a solid entity model, really leveraging some of the scaffolding features in Twitter Bootstrap, it really helped us very quickly kind of switch over this model and get a lot more benefit out of responsive design and out of some of the web API stuff as well. So anyway, look for that, kind of bookmark that, and like I said, we'll post it out there in about a month to 6 weeks.
So you guys hopefully have seen this slide. This is kind of just a generic one talking about asking you to go explore some of our new preview APIs, so things like the Common Consent Framework, some of the new things we're doing, like the content apps you saw at the beginning, some of the new SDKs. Lots of great stuff coming in the dev world, so hopefully you guys went to the developer keynote on Monday and at least got a high-level glimpse, if not, went to some of the more breakout sessions throughout the week. Again, look for new updates within a lot of our SDKs and things like that, because again, we're doubling down in this. Please go fill out your evaluations. I can't tell you, all of the presenters spend a lot of time putting material together for you guys, and it's important for us to get feedback. So we'd certainly appreciate any sort of feedback that you guys have. And with that, we'll open it up for any questions if you want. It's a big room, so there's some microphones in the back, or feel free to yell it, and I'll do my best to repeat any sort of questions you guys might have. Thanks. I see a question over here. Yeah, so the question was, in Outlook, how did it know to show a certain the applications in the app bar? So what happens in mail apps is mail apps are based upon activation rules. Activation rules can be based on a known type. It can also be based on regular expression. So if you noticed, all of our help desk tickets had a certain pattern. It was HD, certain number of characters, and what we do is we do a regular expression match on that. So any email that has that number we'll go and look it up in the help desk system. So it's based on activation rules. That's what's really great about these. There's not a company out there that doesn't have some sort of pattern they could build a mail app out of. Purchase order numbers, procurement, you name it, there's some sort of number you can match on. Question? Deep linking? Oh, yeah. So good question. So what we were talking about there is, if I were to save the help desk page as a favorite. Yep. So it was released when we updated the tooling. I think it's only available in Visual Studio 2013. So that might be why you're not seeing it, but I know it's in the 2013 tooling. Now, I'll tell you this. All it is a class file, a CS file. So if you're in 2012 tooling, I've had a lot of people reach out to me and say, hey, can you just send me that file? And what's that? Yeah. Yeah, I did the same thing. So the first version of this, we created a context util that went, and the first thing it did was check, hey, do we have the right context? If not, go do the redirect and back. That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, it just, that utility handles it for you now.
Yeah, so here was the help desk, the Excel app. And kind of the idea here was that we want to have a very easy kind of user experience for connecting to the services, connecting to the data, and kind of dumping that into a table format. And what's nice about that, once you get into a table format, you can actually do suggested charts or anything else. So anything kind of laws of physics, anything that works in Excel works in kind of data tables as well. But if you look at kind of the user experience, it's kind of a guided experience to help them either select surveys or select the help desk ticket range and whatnot. And we can kind of see help desk by category and things like that because it just is in the data.
So yeah, I guess maybe just showing that export here. And if I went to a new sheet, or I'll add another one here, I can just select my range. So if I want to do from the full year and do get tickets, it just gives me that raw data. So that, again, we didn't want to have to guess. We'll just give you the raw data. You do with it as you please.
Any other questions? Yeah, back here.
Oh. Question was, can I interact with the ribbon? As it stands today, in Office apps, we don't have hook-ins to the ribbon. So what I can do is I can bind between in this case, a task pane app or a content app. I can bind to parts of my document, but I can't reach out to the ribbon. Maybe in the future, I know that's an ask, but it's not currently available. You had a question up here in the front?
Yeah.
The question is how do you get context-based information if it's not server-side code? So what I'm sorry? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard someone say something else. What we do is, and again, I'm getting a little bit deeper here, but in the Office JavaScript object model, so it's JavaScript, what you can do is there's something called office.context.document.location. It's a little bit long. It'll be on the recording. Office.context.document.location. What that is, that's the location of where the file came from. So given that, I can figure out that they came from a specific SharePoint site. I know what SharePoint site this app was connected to. So then you don't have that available to you right now.
Yeah.
So the question is that's because all that worked because I hosted in SharePoint. What if I didn't host it in SharePoint?
Yeah, if you hosted it on a file system or some other place where you can get current user, current identity, you could certainly get the current user. So like if I had it hosted on a file system or something that I can get a Windows identity, I can certainly do it that way as well. But what you can't do is you can't necessarily call back into SharePoint. In this case, if we did that. So it depends on what you're calling into. But you can always grab the current user identity because it's a web app. So that's a possibility.
And I'll go beyond that. Is what you can't do is make it automatic. But what I can do, and I shouldn't have said yes there, but I think it'll still work. Is here's an example of an application that is it doesn't know ahead of time. It's actually a provider-hosted application. So what happens when it launches here? It's going to ask me, what SharePoint site are you relevant to, so I can connect to it. And then what it's going to do, it's actually going to go take me to a login. So you can do things like that, like actually have your OAuth flow in the app. It's not as clean. Again, that's why we chose to host it out of the SharePoint site. But you do have creative options that you can go about doing it.
Any other questions?
Guys, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
nope.
Back there. That's a good question. So the question is, where did you decide on making a SharePoint hosted app or a provider hosted app? So, you know, I guess my take, and you can feel free to add on to this, my take is that SharePoint hosted apps are good for, they're good for kind of, you know, client-side JavaScript type of applications. Because we had a lot of business logic and we had database logic and whatnot, you know, obviously we had the services side there. Now, you can actually have a SharePoint hosted app and you can have your services separate. The challenge with that, if you've ever done that, the challenge with that is the debugging and development process ends up being pretty challenging sometimes. So you know, if you look at that experience, it makes it a lot more sense to have that UI living in the provider-hosted app and debug it that way. So for me, it kind of felt like night and day difference, because I've tried it the other way in other applications, and I ended up spending a lot of cycles through the debugging experience and whatnot. So it usually makes sense to have your UI, as far as a kind of an easy debugging experience, to have the UI live with the provider-hosted app.
I would go beyond that to say that in a SharePoint hosted app, you have you certainly do not have control over the entire screen, right? You kind of have to work within the constraints of the UI of that subsite, because that's what you have as a subsite, and you get a page. You get to work within the page of that subsite, and therefore, you know, as we looked and wanted more full control over what the user experience was, that was another big driver. Is if you want full control, you have to be out of SharePoint, and so that was a big one. So, good question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so the thing was the question was around data loss. I'll speak to data loss on two aspects. Yeah, when it's SharePoint hosted, any data that you have in there, and that whole backup, like restoring if someone accidentally deleted the app, that's a whole beast I don't want to get into here. But yeah, so that was certainly a concern. The other one is if I were going to do that, if I were going to create all my services and have those run out on a web server, and that's all my web server does is provide a bunch of services, then I'm talking cross-domain, and cross-domain, I'm more limited in what I can do there from a REST API standpoint. I start getting into using things like JSON-P that are, you know, where I can't do so much things with posts that might be more secure. So, yeah, I would say it was a pretty easy decision from our standpoint.
And even, so like the Nintex one, they've got, if you've gone out there and played with kind of the Nintex workflow engine, the new model they've got, that's actually a provider-hosted app, but it's all using kind of client-side script in a lot of areas. So, you know, even if you're wanting to do client-side script, there's still a lot of value in actually having that as a provider-hosted app, especially if you're wanting to hook into other things. So, and having the UI experience and whatnot. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's a good question. You probably ought to ask our wives. Is how much? So the question was, how much effort was put into that? We worked on it part-time for about a 6-week period, I guess.
Yeah, I would say a 6-week period. One of the things I would say is that we literally did go completely through our whole UI design several times. we were like, okay, let's do, our first design was like a splitting image of the Azure portal, because we really liked that user interface. And then we were like, no, this is too much of a copy. Let's do it with the Chrome control. And then we were like, no, that's not as, it's harder to do responsive with. And then we ended up back with something that was more custom. So, you know, I think we probably strung it out longer than it needed to be. But I would say, you know, a couple guys for 6 weeks was probably somewhat accurate.
And and it was probably probably about a 30-hour, 20-hour nights and week.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
Since you're going where I see a lot of things going to more of the provider hosted, is Microsoft going to help write some tools? Because if we take it out of SharePoint and still kind of use SharePoint as backend, we throw a lot of the front end code away that like has rendered the list. And I know there's like JS render, JS grid, but you're still throwing a lot of stuff away. And you kind of have to, it's kind of hard trying to pick and choose. Because if you stay in SharePoint, you're limited. But if you go to provider hosted, you got to rewrite a lot of functionality that was already there for you. So is Microsoft going to put out some utilities that are going to make some of this transition a little bit easier?
I think that's a really valid point is, you know, when you're provider hosted, you're kind of, in a way, starting from a blank slate completely. You know, one of the things I would say is, you know, being SharePoint developers, and hopefully now we have more general developers that come to something like the developer sessions at SharePoint Conference, but you know, SharePoint's traditionally been a web forms world. I mean, that's kind of where I've spent my last decade almost, just because that's kind of what you could do with SharePoint was web forms. MVC is a little bit different, right? MVC, there are starter packs where I can get a UI a lot more, a lot quicker. You can go get, you know, assets that you can basically brand and build out very quickly. And also in addition to that, you know, if you do the default MVC apps in Visual Studio, it's already including things like Twitter Bootstrap, which has a whole UI component of its own. So I think there are things that can help speed that up. Beyond that, if you haven't seen, I'll make a selfless plug out to officeams.codeplex.com. We basically, within Microsoft, we had a community that went and said, you know, we want that same experience when you're in SharePoint. So things like, I could show you a taxonomy picker and a people picker and a list view control. You would never guess that I was in a provider-hosted app outside of SharePoint. And all it takes is like 2 lines of script to wire up. So we can do, I think we've done a lot to try to help you get a UI fast, but certainly, you know, you're not going to be as fast as just saying, bang, create a subsite and I have a UI. So anyway.
But even on the update of the SDKs, they're putting more and more controls in that.
That's right.
Yeah. So so they are doing. You saw they've got People Picker and they've got the list view control in the new SDK that came out last week. So they are trying to address the gaps there, and then the other initiatives addressing more of it as well.
Well, guys, we'll hang out here and answer any more questions if you want. Actually, Nathan has a session directly after this, so he may not, but I'll be here as long as you guys want to ask some questions and I'm not getting kicked out. So thanks a lot for coming, and have a wonderful conference.